All right, so I've started doing reacts on different TV series. And of course, as a venture capitalist, how could I not do reacts on Silicon Valley? So here's the first one I'm going to do. It's a short clip, but one that I think is pretty interesting. And I'm hoping to break it down and provide some insight into how is it that a company could exit for a really big number and yet the founder end up with pretty much nothing. Let's watch it.
Well, look who's the big swinging dick.
Hey, Javid. Everything okay at Ghoulie Bib?
You gotta ask them. They canned me.
What?
Yeah. Our investors got spooked by a possible down round, so they shoved an acquisition down my throat.
Yeah, an acquisition of 200 million, right?
Okay, so first, let's break down all. He just threw out a ton of jargon. So down rounds, spooked by a down round, and so they shoved an acquisition down his throat. So here's what happens. As a venture capitalist, you get kind of rated on the value of your portfolio, right? And what's challenging as a venture capitalist is that your investment is locked up in these shares of these private companies for years and years and years before you can get liquidity. And then on top of that, the only changes that you have in valuation typically come from when a company raises more money. So what he's talking about is this down round concept. And what he's alluding to is that his company wasn't performing very well or well enough to maintain its current valuation or the valuation at which the investors had invested at in the last round. And so they would have to take a down round, or in other words, the valuation would be lower than the prior round. And what that would do to the investors is it would push down the value of their investment. They would have to effectively show a loss, which the VCs may not want to do, because if they take a down round and a loss on their portfolio, even though it's just a paper loss and the company could totally come back, they may not want to do it because maybe they're going out to fundraise and now they have to show that they have an underperforming portfolio company. And so in that case, they may say, I don't want to take the down round. I don't want to take the hit on my portfolio. Instead, I'm going to push you to sell the business, which is what he's talking about, shoving that acquisition down his throat. It's not so much that the VC really wants to sell for 200 million. Maybe they think there's a bigger opportunity out there long term, but they don't want to take the down round in the meantime.
Yeah, they all made out. I had a reverse vest with no triggers. And then I lost all of my shares when they fired me.
Okay, so then what he's saying is yeah, but you sold for $200 million. So 200 million sounds like a lot of money, right? And if you're an entrepreneur and, he was the founder, he probably owned somewhere, I don't know. I mean, I don't know how much he had raised up until that point, but it's probably safe to assume that he probably owned at least 25% of the business. But they forced him to reverse vest. The way that works is they basically said, okay, so that 25% that you own in the company, we're going to make it so that those are now options and that they vest over time. So you don't actually own anything in the company. You only own part of the company if you continue to stick around and perform well, and then we'll give you back the shares. The reason why venture capitalists will do this sometimes is because they want to make sure that the entrepreneur has skin in the game, that they're going to stick around, they're going to keep working. They're not just going to be I got my chunk of money, I'm out, and I'm going to go sit on the beach, and you guys, the investors, can figure out who's going to run this thing. So in order to avoid that, oftentimes VCs will force major shareholders like founders and so forth, especially if they are critical to the business, to reverse vest their ownership. And then what he said, there's no triggers. So usually there's a trigger at which these options or these shares vest in his favor, right? So it could be a common one is a year. Every year there's a cliff, and maybe they say, okay, over the next 4 years, 25% of your ownership will vest each year. And it'll be a 1-year cliff is what they call it. As in you get nothing up until day 364, but on 365, boom, you get your shares. You get a quarter of your shares. So that's kind of that cliff idea. But effectively what he's saying is there were no triggers, which meant he didn't get any of his shares back. And then they fired him. And so if you get fired, if you have options that have vested, then you have the option to buy those those shares, to exercise those options. But usually you only have like a month to make that decision. But if you haven't vested those shares, you don't even have that option to exercise your options. And so you're kind of in a tough spot where, you know, in his case, like he lost all of his ownership in the business. The VCs ended up doing pretty well because they probably got like their percentage share of his shares, right? Because where else were they going to go? They were going to get distributed to all the other current shareholders. So they made money there. And then on top of that, they probably had what are called liquidation preference rights. So if the company gets acquired for a number that's less than what they invested at, then they would get all of their money back first before any of the common shareholders would get their money. That's the way a liquidation preference works. It can be even more beneficial to the VCs if they have what's called a participating liquidation preference. So in a participating liquidation preference, it's the like you get your cake and eat it too clause, as I like to refer to it. So basically the way that works is I get my money that I invested back, plus I get my implied ownership of the company as well. So just to illustrate it for you, let's say, like in this case, that the investors invested at a $100 million valuation and they put $10 million into the business. So they own 10% of the company. And then the company gets acquired for $20 million. Well, in that case, with a 1x non-participating liquidation preference, they would get 10%. They would effectively convert their shares from preferred shares that have the liquidation preference into common shares where they would get their ownership percentage, and they would get $20 million from that transaction. And that would be a win for them. But if there was another scenario where the business sold for $50 million, in that case, they wouldn't convert into common and they would maintain their ownership as preferred shares where they would get their liquidation preference. In that event, instead of getting $5 million, which would be 10% of the $50 million exit value, they would get $10 million back. And then that would leave $40 million for everybody else to split up, usually the common shares. The flip side is, what happens though if they have a participating liquidation preference or participating preferred? In that case, they get their money back, that $10 million, and then they get to convert. So in that case, let's say the company sells for $200 million, like he talked about, they would get their $10 million back. So now there's $190 million left on the table, and then they would get another 10% of what's left. So they would get another $19 million for a total return of almost $30 million. So on a deal where it generated a 2x, the investors would pull out almost a 3x return on their investment. And it gets even crazier. So let's say that the company gets acquired for $100 million, the same valuation at which the investors participated and invested at. Well, with a participating preferred, they would get their $10 million back. That leaves $90 million left. And then they would get 10% of what was left of that $90 million. So they get another $9 million. So they would cash out $19 million on a deal that was basically valued at the same price at which they invested. Some of the terms that are placed into these term sheets and negotiated with founders can be pretty aggressive towards founders, right? Like in his case, he didn't make any money. One of my mentors, George Zachary, years ago was part of a startup that ended up going south. And they ended up selling it, kind of a fire sale. And what was ironic is that the investors ended up making quite a bit of money on that investment. And all of the founders ended up losing basically everything. They didn't get any money on the deal because of these liquidation preference structures. And he was actually homeless for about 6 months, if I remember correctly, before he was able to find his next job. Fortunately, that sort of thing doesn't happen super often anymore because venture investors realize that their reputation is built on how they treat entrepreneurs when times are tough, not just when times are good. And so that has brought about this whole idea of being entrepreneur friendly, having clean term sheets without egregious terms and so forth, that I think has generally been a really good positive movement for the industry and for entrepreneurs and investors alike. Anyways, let me know what you think of my React video, if you liked it, if I should do more of these. And in the meantime, check out some of my other React videos, like my Shark Tank React on Breathometer. Thanks.